What is up, everybody? What are we on? Episode 113 on a Friday of Pursuit of Balance. What's going on there, guys? So, we're going to talk about some nutrition stuff today. I'm going to take a little right turn. I feel like I haven't talked about nutrition in a while. And we're going to talk about a really, really simple strategy. This is going to be short and sweet. When it comes to diet stuff and diet advice, you know, there was a while, and I think honestly more recently, like during the pandemic, where I started doing a lot more certifications and workshops and reading books and trying to, understand nutrition a little bit more at a granular level. And I think when you go into the education of any space, you tend to make it, it's like a confirmation bias thing, but you tend to make it more complicated than it should, right? And then over time, I started kind of backpedaling a little bit of like, okay, like instead of like trying to be this like ingenious scientist about all this stuff, like what's some simple strategies that everyone can follow? The number one thing that pops up in the longevity space, the weight loss space, is caloric deficit, right? So I think all of us know that in order to live a long time, be happy, be healthy, be lean, we need to maintain some level of a caloric deficit. Not every day, not all the time, but for the majority of the time, right? And well, at least especially for weight loss. And when you look at caloric deficits, obviously there's ways to, go about it as far as tracking foods and, weighing foods and all that stuff. And in my personal experience, both for myself and for clients, is tracking is a great tool because not only is it going to hold you accountable to them being more aware of it, but being accountable to actually what you're eating and tracking and drinking and putting all those things in your body. So I think that it creates an accountability system for a lot of people, and it creates a lot of awareness on what you're eating or what you're not eating enough of, maybe, right? So, the elementary version, which I've said this so many times to so many people, is like calories are the law of thermodynamics, meaning if you wanted to lose weight, you need to be eating less than what you're burning, right? Or maintenance or surplus, whatever the goal is, right? Second layer of nutrition is going to be the composition of the food you're eating. So between the protein, carbs, fats, fibers, alcohol, water, I always call it kind of my 6 macros, but most of us know protein, fat, and carbs. Those are going to dictate the composition of your body, right? So the composition of the food is going to dictate the composition of your body. Meaning, if I'm eating the exact amount of calories that I need to do to lose weight, but I'm maybe not losing the optimal ratio of fat compared to lean body mass, then that means your macronutrients are off, right? Probably undereating on protein and overeating a lot of everything else. And then the last third layer, which is the deepest layer as far as health goes and how you feel and how your body operates, is going to be the nutrient density, which is going to be the micronutrients, right? So we look at calories, we look at macros, we look at micros. But the one thing that I always try to bring up to everyone is how do I make a caloric deficit sustainable, right? Like I think that's like the biggest struggle piece, because a lot of us know, like, okay, like if I don't even change the strategy around the food I'm eating, I just say, let's just eat the same diet that you're currently doing, and let's go about it in a way where we track, and then we will eventually, over time, days, weeks, and months in the future, start to refine down on where you're screwing up. Like, okay, well, these foods are bringing in more carbs than fats, and these foods are not bringing enough protein, or this food's not bringing enough fiber. At the end of the day, a whole food approach is always the most simple way to go about eating. And this is like, if I can give you one thing to just, if I were to cut this thing off right now, if you were to just cook your own food and buy whole foods, fruits and vegetables and meat only, right? Maybe a little bit of dairy. Obviously, eggs would be in that conversation. There's some nuance, like the fats you cook with, little things like that. But if you were to just really make that majority of your diet, it's really hard to fuck up. Like, it really is. Even it doesn't matter if you were a carnivore or a vegan. If you're eating whole foods majority of the times, it is really, really hard to screw up what your body's doing. There's nuance, as I said, that there's definitely context to that as far as optimal health goes. My personal belief on nutrition is more omnivorous, meaning like I think having a balance between animal foods and plant foods is probably going to be most optimal for longevity, for health, for sustainability of everything we're talking about. But the thing that I want to talk about, the famous word, is going to be satiety, satiation, right? Because the thing that makes dieting miserable for so many people, and I remember this a lot with my diet, like when I was doing dieting for like men's physique competitions and things like that, I remember like, dude, there would be times where I would cook like a Sunday, I would cook a lot of meat, or like cook prep, maybe 3, 4, maybe 5 days of food, and I was eating multiple meals a day, so not just like 2 like I am now, but 3 to 5 meals a day. Generally leaner cuts of food, right? So maybe a lean red meat, but 90% of the time it was either chicken breast or tilapia. and I'd have some like white rice, maybe potatoes, and then like an ounce or two of vegetables just to have some fiber in the body, so like I can at least still go to the bathroom and feel like I was healthy. I wasn't really eating fruit, and was cutting sugar completely out. And the thing that I always struggled with was the cravings, right? Like I would go through places or times, I mean, where I'd be like, oh man, I am just craving some sweetness or some sugar. And like, I do believe at a very visceral level that like your body's giving cravings generally on what it wants or what it needs. But I also do believe on the other side of that conversation that a lot of our eating habits, just like most things in life, are very habitual, right? Like we're used to eating certain things and we naturally crave more of those things. But coming back to this famous word satiety, right? Like when you're eating foods that are hyper palatable, hyper processed, filled with carbs and fats, you're not going to have a lot of satiety from that, right? And when you don't get these satiety signals in your body, it's very easy to overeat. So I want to kind of cover quickly today, and just in a short version of it, like what are the things that are going to help with satiety, right? Because there's not only things that we can do from an eating perspective on how we eat that are going to help with that. There's obviously a food selection thing. There's obviously things that we can do to help counteract some hunger. But the goal when we think about a caloric deficit, and this is very specific to caloric deficit today, right? I'm not saying for people that maybe are trying to eat more food, these strategies would probably be maybe the opposite. Or for the most part, I think they would be the opposite. So number one thing is obviously coming back to these, like, okay, what are the foods that bring the most satiation, right? As far as the macro composition between protein, fat, and carbs, protein is pretty high on the satiety level, right? And then fat's also pretty high too, right? It slows down the process of these. And carbs, there's context to it because carbs in a simple form are the worst. Carbs in a fibrous form are going to be some of the best. So when you think about, okay, well, if I want to be able to create a caloric deficit and hit the macronutrients and the calories that I need to be able to do, but I do not want to fight hunger all the time, primarily, most of your food needs to be around meat, right? And I think this is just a core foundation for all success in the nutrition world. Majority of your meals and your food just needs to be meat, right? Like today, for this morning, I had leftover steak, and I just brought myself some steak, nothing else, right? And just having some steak and literally just don't even need a fork. I was just eating it in the car. The more we can prioritize animal foods and animal muscle meat, organ meats a little bit too, as far as health goes, that is probably one of the most satiating foods out there, right? Well, I wouldn't say the most, but it's definitely really, really high up on that scale. So the number one thing for all things nutrition is like you need to prioritize more animal meats, right? And if you're a vegetarian or you're a vegan, obviously there's going to be some things that I'll talk about here in a second. But my argument against that is if you're doing vegetarian or vegan approach for optimal health, it's not, in my opinion, the most optimal approach to nutrition. Now, if there's some cultural things or some beliefs or just animal right things, different subject. I'm not here to persuade you. Second thing is when we look at plant foods, right? Plant foods do come in a couple categories, right? Because we have, like, as far as fiber goes, that's one of the reasons why plant foods help with satiety. There's soluble fiber and there's insoluble fiber. But it doesn't matter what, like, just to make it really simple for you guys, like, you're getting fiber from plant foods, right? But as we all know, there's certain foods that are going to bring more satiation than others, right? So if I were to give you an example, fruit is going to be a plant food, right? Vegetables are going to be plant foods. But the amount that you'll get from, as far as satiety goes, from a vegetable versus a fruit is going to be dramatically different. And I think a lot of that is obviously due to the sugar content and the carbohydrates that you're getting from fruit and the sweetness, right? Like our body craves that sweetness. Like I love fruit. Fruit was one of the things that honestly got me off of desserts and sweets and the processed candies. Because it still gets that craving for my brain to be like, okay, cool, I got a sweetness, right? So like me having a peach at the end of the night or a box of berries, I feel zero remorse or regret when I do that versus like, oh, I had a bag of candy, some Sour Patch Kids or something like that, right? So, and the reason why we want to prioritize vegetables for a lot of people that are looking at weight loss over fruit, and I think this is where there's some context required for people that I think a lot of people get scared away from fruit because, oh, it's sugar, it's carbs. But even then, I would much rather someone get full on a box of blueberries or some watermelons or things like that because it's going to bring more nutrient density, it's going to bring more hydration, and like how many people do you know that are overweight and sick because they overeat on fruit, right? So I hate that that's a message sometimes that people think that, oh, okay, well, if I eat too much fruit, I'm just going to get fat. And the reality is, like, it requires so much of that to happen. But vegetables, if I were to think about, like, a carrot or a potato or a salad or anything like that, like carrots and potatoes I really love. I've always kind of done this unconsciously, but obviously with some intent every once in a while, is like if I want to be a little bit more limited on the amount of carbs or reduce my calories overall, I tend to eat more potatoes versus rice. I eat a lot of rice. 90% of my diet, I think, and meals is just rice. I think it's easier for me to eat. It's an easy digesting carb. And then as far as like obviously everything on the satiety, I think rice doesn't really do much for that, which is obviously kind of the exact opposite of what I'm talking about today, right? So it's like if you're trying to be in a caloric deficit, then yeah, maybe white rice all the time is not going to be the most optimal for you if you have trouble with overeating. If you don't have trouble, then there's nothing to be scared of with white rice or fruit, just like I'm talking about. But potatoes or carrots and little things like that as far as snacking goes, they're going to be something that's going to allow you to actually have some fiber, build some bulk in the stool, and it's going to allow you to kind of cross off that little hunger signal into the body because you're going to be a little bit more satiated, right? So the number one thing to understand is like coming back to the simple rules of just eating whole foods. If you're eating animal meats and protein and organs and things like that that are animal foods, they're going to bring satiety, they're going to bring protein, they're going to bring some healthy fats. If you're eating plant foods from Mother Nature, right? So vegetables and fruits and organic as possible, you're going to get a lot more vitamins and a lot more minerals and a lot more hydration, a lot fiber, and that also in return is going to help with some satiety. So back to the original point, if you can make majority of your diet these things, once again, really, really hard to screw up, right? And those little tips and tricks for you guys, right? It's like if I am having trouble with, like for me, I don't eat enough, so I prefer white rice so I can get foods in. It helps me, like if I'm eating salmon with potatoes, it's not as easy for me to eat as much salmon as it is doing white rice with salmon, because I can just mix the fish together and the rice together, and because my fiance loves salmon and I'm not really a huge fan of it, but when we do it together as a family, obviously, like I sacrifice. When I eat red meat, she sacrifices. When she eats salmon, I sacrifice. But those little tips and tricks can go both directions, right? So if I wanted to eat more, I use white rice. If I wanted to be a little bit more cautious of calories or try to be a little bit more restricted on some areas, I'll use things that bring more fiber, right? So potatoes or, excuse me, carrots or squash or just more vegetables, period, right? Because those things will add some bulk and that will obviously slow me down as far as eating goes. The second part of this conversation is going to be the how you're eating, right? And this is something that a lot of people overlook. How you eat is going to dictate how much you eat, right? And there is a delay between your stomach and the brain and the signal of being full that most people bypass because they eat like my dog. Like they're not even breathing between bites. If you were to just slow it down, you were to think about drinking your food and trying to take, and it's just not like what I love about this strategy is I'm not telling you to eat less or more different foods even. I'm telling you to just slow down how you're eating, because if you can really just take the time to like really chew your food, and like the strategy of thinking that like, oh, we're drinking our food, even if it's solid, means that I'm just taking the time that there's the second stage of digestion is chewing. The first one is visual. So when you look at food, I mean, look at a dog, like my dog drools all over my leg when I'm eating it there, because that's the first thing. Your body starts salivating and you start to chew, you break down the food. Then your digestive system takes care of the rest until it goes out. That system obviously has a signal to the brain of like, if I'm eating really, really fast, I'm kind of bypassing the like, oh shit, I'm actually, a lot of cultures, there's different names for this, but the whole rule of like, we should eat to 80% full, the whole reason behind that is like eating to 80% currently is going to be 100% in about 5 or 10 minutes. If you eat to 100% in 5 or 10 minutes, you're going to be like, oh my God, I'm stuffed. You might have an overwhelming blood sugar spike and crash. Like there's going to be things that's going to make you a little bit tired and lethargic. So I always, as a strategy for people with weight loss, and a simple thing to think about is just like drink the food, slow it down, eat slowly, chew your food. That strategy alone is going to allow you to kind of let the satiety signal that's naturally going to come anyways do its time and do its thing, and actually obviously provide that. Third part for me is then looking at, and I think about this more in a natural, holistic way, is appetite suppressants are not a bad thing, right? So coffee has probably been caffeine, right? Well, coffee is part of this, but caffeine is probably one of the best weight loss thermogenic supplements that we have naturally and holistically accessible. So between teas or coffees, or if you're doing anything that's maybe a little bit more artificial, pre-workouts, or like obviously like a lot of weight loss pills are just pumped with a bunch of caffeine. Use caffeine and coffee wisely, because I think coffee is a superfood. The only time I think coffee is something that I would really maybe be a little bit more careful with kind of suggesting towards someone having is if someone really, really has a very stressful life, if they have really, really high cortisol levels, or they're very anxious. coffee can maybe make that worse. But, you know, there's things that kind of inhibit that a little bit. Maybe put a little L-theanine in the coffee as a supplement. That will kind of help with some of the jitters, the shakes, or the anxiety. But coming back to caffeine, caffeine is an appetite suppressant, right? So when we come back to this weight loss theory of like, if my goal is to have satiety, meaning I'm not thinking about food, then I want to do little things throughout the day in between my meals or before my meals that, you know, obviously suppress the appetite, right? And I think caffeine is one of the most powerful tools that you have to use that. So having a cup of coffee or tea in the morning, right? Or even maybe like I do too sometimes, even before I even have my workout and my first meal. I love caffeine as a pre-workout, as an energy booster, as obviously a fat burner. I don't really use it for that intention, but I love for the fact that I can just literally go through my day, my morning, I mean, and not have to think about food. I think one of the things that would be a really terrible, hard place to be in is always craving food, always thinking about food. Like, I eat because I know I should. I do enjoy eating. I love food, but I'm not someone that like thinks about it all day, right? Like, I'd rather just be focusing on my work, focusing on my things that I need to be doing throughout the day, do my workout, have a post-workout meal, go home, have dinner with my fiance, and then like call it a day. Like if I had 2 good meals a day, ideally I would probably throw a shake or a small third meal if I can, but I've been in a bad place with it. But from a satiety perspective, leverage caffeine, right? Like use this as a supplement. The only thing you need to be aware of is for most of us, maybe like before 2 p.m. is where you should cut it off, right? Or up to 2 p.m., I'm sorry. If you're less caffeine sensitive, maybe you can go a little bit later in the day. Like I'll generally have coffee all the way up to like 4 or 5. You know, my fiance is Italian and her family has cups of coffee after dinner sometimes, which like a lot of Europeans do, which always trips me out because it sounds counterintuitive to our sleep advice that most of us receive, right? But for most of us, right, it's like think about till 2 or 4 p.m. It should be like the max that you're having that last caffeine. But using that to kind of leverage as an appetite suppressant in the beginning part of the day, right? I used to do a lot of like even chewing gum. Like I would just chew gum in between because a lot of times I think the hunger signal comes from boredom for a lot of us. So I think just having something that satisfies that feeling of either drinking something or chewing on something. There's little things that you can do that sound like kind of stupid when you hear it, but like coffee, caffeine, things like that are going to be your best friend. Chewing gum, obviously depending on the type of gum you're doing. Those are all little things that I would use to kind of help suppress the appetite. So the number one thing I want to leave you guys with, I wanted to keep this one short, is focus on things that provide satiation and satiety, because when you have satiety with your diet, nutrition, and lifestyle, you're not thinking about food all the time. And when you're not thinking about food all the time, it's much easier for you to stay in a caloric deficit and eat less food because you're not victim to that hunger, right? So when you can really counteract that signal of hunger, you're in a good place. The thing that I will warn you about is sometimes, and I'm someone that really deals with this, that fight against hunger and the fight for satiety can sometimes get you in trouble of not eating enough of the right things, right? So if you're doing all these things, right, and you feel like, okay, well now I'm under eating on protein or I'm under eating on nutrients or maybe even calories to a too big of an extreme, then yeah, maybe back off on some of these things and change the food selection a little bit, maybe a little more fruit instead of vegetables, maybe a little bit more fattier cuts. But you just need to be aware, obviously, for you and your goal and you and the individual life that you have, like what are the calories that I need to be able to have to be successful with my goal, right? What are the macros that I need to have? And then how do I kind of develop a plan around that that's going to allow me to be more sustainable with that as well, right? All right, guys, well, that's it. I wanted to keep today short, so I will see you guys next Friday. And as always, if you guys have any suggestions on things, I love hearing them for you guys. It makes life a lot easier for me to know what to kind of spit some game on and talk and speak my knowledge on and share it with everyone else. So see you guys later. Take care.